and they seemed as anxious to recover them as if they had lost them themselves. And this seems to suggest that there's something binding in the experience of loss. And I know that there's one poem that Archie has where he makes this very explicit. And, maybe we can read that too.
Mm-hmm.
It's the poem for Harold Bloom. I mentioned him earlier. And, let me just read it. I went to the summit and stood in the high nakedness. The wind tore about this way and that in confusion, and its speech could not get through to me, nor could I address it. Still, I said as if to the alien in myself, I do not speak to the wind now, for having been brought this far by nature, I have been brought out of nature, and nothing here shows me the image of myself. For the word tree, I have been shown a tree, and for the word rock, I have been shown a rock. For stream, for cloud, for star, this place has provided firm implication and answering. But where here is the image for longing? So I touched the rocks, their interesting crusts. I flaked the bark of stunt fir. I looked into space and into the sun, and nothing answered my word, longing. Goodbye, I said. Goodbye, nature so grand and reticent. Your tongues are healed up into their own element, and as you have shut up, you have shut me out. I am as foreign here as if I had landed, a visitor. So I went back down and gathered mud, and with my hand made an image for longing. I took the image to the summit. First I set it here on the top rock, but it completed nothing. Then I set it there among the tiny firs, but it would not fit. So I returned to the city and built a house to set the image in. And men came into my house and said, that is an image for longing. And nothing will ever be the same again.
Yes, this is a very interesting poem because it's, as you said, unusual in that in this poem he talks about being brought out of nature, which is really surprising. This idea that to be human is, as we've said all along, to be part of this movement of nature, and yet suddenly in this poem, to be human is also to have this longing that seems to be something that is beyond nature itself. And my interpretation of this longing that is uniquely human is that it's precisely human attachment, that the things that we love, we long for, and we long for them because they are indeed caught in time. And so it's really impossible to separate love and grief, I think, at least in Ammons's poetry. And it's interesting, of course, that the poem ends with the image for longing, which it's almost like an allegory of the creation of religion, the end of this poem, right? That you build an image for longing and you build a house for it, and you turn what you long for into an object, and something is lost there.
I think there are biblical allusions too about the creation of Adam through the mud and the and then even a kind of let's say an ecology. If you take the word ecology from the two Greek words oikos, which means house, and logos, which means the word, mm-hmm. he builds a house for this word, longing. And men, when they come into that house, they say that is an image for longing, and one can't help but imagine that this house is his poetry, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. that other people read and recognize, or should recognize, that there is this constant longing at work in the poem, even Corson's Inlet, which we were reading, precisely, I think, because of what you said, that we are both inside and outside of nature, that our longing is not so much a longing for closure as it is a longing for for everything that time keeps depriving us of, by the fact that the flow of time is a series of constant losses of one sort or another. And how can one possibly be human without having to grieve somehow the, that part of the process? Now, it's true, every new walk is a new walk. There's new possibility and new birth, and one is constantly being reborn in the new. But there's also this other story that he does not neglect, I think.
He doesn't neglect it. I think he's very discreet about it and deliberately. And we haven't really brought up the word love very much, which doesn't appear very much in his poetry, but I think is nonetheless very important in that, at least the way I read him, especially in his long poem Sphere, that is a whole poem about this kind of movement and both the grief and the joy of this kind of movement. He talks about love a little bit, and I think love becomes the force that binds the world, perhaps, but also the force that unbinds. So, but it is certainly the force. I would say the thing, the reality. And so, I think my image that I derive from his poetry is that we, when we have these moments of cohesion that are also events or connections with other people or with a countryside or with an idea even, these moments of cohesion are events in time, and yet I think he longs for some sort of preservation of the importance of such events, right? So you can't hold on to them, but to some degree you can cherish them, and that's, I think, what the house that contains the image for longing can do, and that what his poetry can do actually is to celebrate these events of cohesion, of encounter, and they're temporary. And one of my favorite lines from the poem Sphere is when he writes that love is better awry than any other quantity true, right? So love is better even when it's sort of helter-skelter, when it's temporary, when it's wrong in various ways, but it's still better than any other quantity true. So this movement of binding and unbinding is the most important thing.
Yeah, we should tell our listeners that this poem Sphere is a whole long book, and its subtitle is The Form of Emotion, and I think it won the Bollinger Prize back in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of love, there might be a reason why he doesn't mention it very much in his corpus. And I began in my introduction with some verses from Tombstones, and in that longer poem, he writes the following. And I hadn't thought of it in these terms, but it's coming to me now. If love is fine, and stones are harsh evanescences, by harsh evanescences I think he means they seem to be solid, but they're as evanescent as everything else if you look at it in the longer term perspective. If love is fine and stones are harsh evanescences, how may we dishonor love to letter down its name, wasting the love on hard waters of inscription?
That's beautiful.
And this idea, the hard waters of inscription, I think has to be an allusion to Keats in Rome. Here lies one whose name was written in water. The waters of inscription. But then he goes on to say, the universe is itself love's memorial. Every cliff face, rocky loft having spent itself through love's light, held here till love again burn it free. 90% of the universe is dead stars, but look how the light still plays flumes down millennial ranges.
Yes, I agree that certainly fits very well what I was saying, the idea that love is actually more, it is the movement, right? It's something far more mobile and beautiful and alive than any inscription or word could contain. And yet, of course, part of life is having these eddies of meaning, these temporary containers for love, these expressions. And I think it's that tension of giving love these temporary realizations that are what we have in life, and yet knowing that it is something greater than we are, that make his poetry extremely beautiful and a real life lesson, I think.
That's why in my monologue, when people might have said Dante and Ammons, is Harrison out of his mind? Well, what I meant is that I think you phrased it very nicely, that love is what time and motion and love, I think, are all the same thing in Ammons, and in Dante in the same way, no? Because love is a form of motion, and if it's the form of motion, one cannot really letter it or give it, in hard waters of inscription.
I think one can give oneself over to it, though. I think that's important too.
Yeah. There's also, of course, you read a poem called Easter Morning, which is a very special day, of course, in the Christian calendar. It's a day of resurrection. There has to be some allusion to that. In Tombstones, let me just bring our attention to one very unusual stanza in this longer poem, which is all about the way in which time is the whole story. And there's just larger and larger orders of time in which everything is in movement through, I guess, the force of love. But there's one very exceptional stanza where he says, "Rivulets of scattering, corruption's way of getting on with things, rememberers unremembered. Still the name," he's talking about the name of the deceased that's engraved in the tombstone. "Still the name will call together in the last time, the new time, in the new morning, all the bits of information, and, the name said, the form will come again, the distance between named and name run." Now, I was working on this poem for my own purposes, and Ammons, with Archie being still alive, I wrote to him, and I said, this is a very bizarre contradiction, that there's going to be a time. What actually does this section 7 mean? And he wrote me back the following: "I haven't the faintest idea what number 7 means. Could it mean the resurrection, the time out of time, which is eternity? Of course, there's no such place, except now, in time, while we think on what is finally, all together and forever. Love, Archie."